Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, distinguished delegates, representatives of the United Nations and the NGO community, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to appear before you today as part of a panel to discuss one of the most neglected areas in the global fight against violence against women, the due diligence obligation of states to prevent such violence from happening in the first place. I would like to thank the organizers, the sponsors of this panel, and the Human Rights Council for including this crucial issue in the agenda of this morning. The due diligence standard is firmly embedded within international human rights law, and it has increasingly become the parameter which measures the level of state compliance with its obligation to prevent and respond to acts of violence against women. The Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, adopted by the General Assembly in 1993, urges states in its Article 4C to exercise due diligence to prevent, investigate, and in accordance with national legislation, to punish acts of violence against women, whether those acts are perpetrated by the state or by private persons. States' efforts in complying with their due diligence obligations should not only focus on legislative reform, access to justice, and the provision of services for victims, but must also address issues of prevention, particularly in terms of eliminating the structural causes that lead to violence against women. As highlighted by my predecessors, states should ensure that the root causes and consequences of violence against women are tackled at all levels of society, from the family to the transnational arena. In doing so, states should consider the multiple forms of violence suffered by women and the different types of discrimination they encounter in order to adopt multifaceted strategies to effectively prevent and combat this human rights violation. In her 1999 report on domestic violence, the first Special Rapporteur developed the following list of considerations for determining state compliance with obligations of due diligence: ratification of international human rights instruments, constitutional guarantees of equality for women, the existence of national legislation and/or administrative sanctions providing adequate redress for women victims of violence, policies or plans of action that deal with the issue of violence against women, the gender sensitivity of the criminal justice system and the policing authorities, accessibility and availability of support services, the existence of measures to raise awareness and modify discriminatory policies in the field of education and the media, the collection of data and statistics concerning violence against women. Although some of these considerations refer specifically to state action once violence has already occurred, it has become increasingly clear that there is a correlation between prevalence rates and effective and responsive accountability measures. The investigation, prosecution, and protection and redress measures offered to women victims of violence will have a direct effect on the prevalence rates of such violence. The absence of effective accountability measures leads to a culture of impunity. It sends a strong message to perpetrators that violence against women is not a serious crime and that, in fact, such crimes are condoned by the state. As regards the addressing of structural causes of violence, I have argued that the state's obligation to provide redress cannot be just about returning women to the situation in which they were found before the individual instance of violence. Reparation measures as part of the due diligence obligation should strive to have a transformative potential and should aspire, to the extent possible, to subvert instead of reinforce pre-existing patterns of cross-cutting structural subordination, gender hierarchies, systemic marginalization, and structural inequalities that may be at the root cause of the violence that women experience. Therefore, the ultimate objective of a state's efforts when investigating and punishing acts of violence against women and when protecting and offering redress to victims of such violence should be the prevention of future acts of violence. But the prevention of violence against women should go beyond legislative measures and must include societal transformation and the empowerment of women. In order for women to be able to progressively realize the full range of their human rights, civil, political, economic, social and cultural, states should promote and support their empowerment through education, skills training, legal literacy and access to productive resources. This will enhance women's self-awareness, self-esteem, self-confidence and self-reliance. Women that are empowered to understand that they are not destined to subordination and violence. They resist internalizing oppression. They develop their capabilities as autonomous beings, and they increasingly question and negotiate the terms of their existence in both public and private spaces. In terms of women's empowerment at the community and family level, states should engage in cultural negotiations through which the root causes of violence against women may be confronted and the oppressive nature of certain societal practices made evident. This cultural negotiation requires identifying and contesting the legitimacy of those who monopolize the right to speak on behalf of culture and religion. This mandate has consistently argued that it is not culture or religion per se that sanctions the beating, mutilation or killing of women, but rather it is those who monopolize the right to speak on behalf of culture or religion. As a consequence, state engagement in women's empowerment and social transformations is central in challenging and changing hegemonic patriarchal structures and practices. Through gender-sensitive language and rights-based discourses in public statements, media reporting, and educational material, states can help demystify gender constructs, challenge taboos, and break the silence around violence. Legislation alone will not be sufficient to prevent acts of violence against women if it is not accompanied by efforts to create an enabling environment to garner the support of the society's various structures and institutions in the fight against violence against women. The fulfillment of women's human rights also requires political will and an adequate allocation of resources to address existing inequalities and discrimination. In taking up these endeavors, states should act without discrimination and must commit the same efforts and resources to preventing, investigating, punishing, and providing remedies for acts of violence against women as they commit to address other forms of violence. States should act in good faith and take positive steps and measures to ensure that women's human rights are protected, respected, promoted, and fulfilled. It is my hope that our discussions here today will contribute to advancing the application by states of their due diligence obligation to prevent future instances of violence against women. I would like to conclude my intervention by encouraging the Human Rights Council to continue addressing this crucial issue of prevention and by encouraging member states to take into consideration the recommendations emanating from this panel when developing their policies and programs on violence against women. Thank you for your attention.